welcome to our good friend and past associate Alistair Pope. Alistair's background dates back to Glasgow in Scotland, circa 1964. Migrated to Australia, and his first job was in outback surveying, of all places. Surveying road and rail to be built for the new iron ore mining projects in the Pilbara. He then joined Cooper Brothers as a cadet accountant before joining the Army by volunteering for national service. One of less than 400 young Australians who did so. He was selected for officer training at Seychelles, Skyville, thanks Alistair, and graduated as a second lieutenant in 1967. Alistair served in Vietnam, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and as a unit commander in the 3rd Brigade. In '81, he attended Army Staff College, Queenscliff. He was one of the first 6 of his class to be promoted to senior officer rank. After 20 years of service, he retired from the Australian Army in 1986 as a Lieutenant Colonel. He was then General Manager of 3 companies and a Director of Consulting Services at SMS, not SMS, before beginning self-employment as a project consultant. He completed major projects at Gas and Fuel, Loy Yang Power Station, managed the build of the Optus network, and then worked internationally in 65 countries for 18 years, recovering projects in the energy, oil and gas, biotech and telecommunications industries using an advanced project management methodology that he developed. Alistair retains a keen interest in current affairs, don't I know it, current military matters and military history. He has had more than 60 articles published in the Australian Defence Force Journal, Strategy and Tactics, World at War, Modern War, Camaraderies, Harim, Tok, Quadrant and Quadrant Online. He has had his first book intended for commercial sale to the publishers. He's also written a detailed family history and 2 books on chess. After a 35-year hiatus, he resumed playing chess competitively and is the current Seniors Correspondence Chess Champion of Australia. Well done, Alistair. You hide your light under a bushel. He considers his greatest achievement was completing a 5,000-piece jigsaw over a period of 3 years. Now retired, he and his wife spent half the year living in their condo in Vietnam and the summer half of the year in Melbourne as couriers and servants to their grandchildren. I can relate to that. This presentation this evening is based upon an article prepared for publishers in the American-based and globally distributed Modern War magazine. It will be further updated in December 2019, passed recently, and published in issue 846, due to be released later this year. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now, this will be a little bit dull because I don't have the slides that I was going to show you, but firstly I'd like to send Daniel Andrews, thank you for letting me come up here from the great state of Victoriastan. The People's Republic. So we're going to give a presentation tonight on the political agenda of the climate deceivers. Now, I want a show of hands here. Who among you believes that climate change is catastrophic? Hands up those that think it's catastrophic. I've actually got 2 deniers here. Okay, good. Because it's not, and I'll prove that to you. So the rest of you actually believe that climate change that's been happening for 4.3 billion years, is actually not catastrophic. And we'll actually the reason I actually mentioned that was because when you look through the evidence here, there's no point in talking to you about all the facts and numbers, because all except two of you here think it's not catastrophic. So why would I waste your time telling you it's not catastrophic? So let's have a look at the political agenda that's involved in climate change. So here's the scope of this presentation. Firstly, my personal journey to climate heresy, a brief climate history and basic scientific logic, and then we'll go on to having a look at the myth of global warming catastrophe, which we've been told is going to be global cooling, global warming, global cooling, and who knows what it is tomorrow and today. So we'll have a look at the various catastrophes. By the way, you can go back, and I was going to write an article called The Perils of Prediction. But when I looked it up on the internet for evidence, I found that everyone else had done it far better than I ever could. And there's 4,500 papers called Perils of Prediction that actually go out to show that none of the predictions that have been made since the year 1000, which by the way was the first end of the world, through until the present day, have ever come true. Of course, Greta, in 29th of September last year, told us the world was going to end in X number of days, and in fact I then calculated it, and it's hardly worth being here, because the world is going to end on the 29th of June 2030. So enjoy, just party, don't bother investing or doing anything worthwhile. We're also drowning at the rate of 3 millimeters per year, which I'll deal with as one of the subjects. We'll have a look at the biblical plagues of Australia, the reasons why we're getting ourselves into such a mess from being previously one of the richest and happiest, I think, countries around. We'll also look at, and this is the important thing, why, with all the evidence in our favour that climate change is not catastrophic, are we losing the war? And what can we do about it? And finally, the decline and fall of Australia as a sovereign nation as a result of the disasters that are self-created. And I suggest you read Jared Diamond's book, very hard read actually, called, not Downfall, that's the Hitler thing, Why Nations Choose to Fail. And in fact, he wrote a book actually and came across the Greenland, the Easter Island, and actually pointed out that all of these nations that have failed, the Aztecs, the Incas, actually chose to fail for whatever reason. And we'll come back to some of that later, because right now Australia is choosing to fail. Now, I'll start off by pointing out, I'm going to summarize about 60 years of my experience in dealing with climate change and other things. This is not a technical or definitive summary, but a common sense study of what a skeptical layman looked when I looked at the available evidence. And there was a number of reasons actually why I started looking at the evidence of climate change. But from the very beginning, climate science has been an unscientific, quasi-religious tool, and that goes back right through history. You can go to a bog in Denmark and dig up the body of someone who was strangled to make it rain the next year so they could grow crops. Now it must have worked, because it rained the next year in Denmark. Who would believe that? Without that personal sacrifice, they probably would have had a drought and everyone would have died of starvation. And you can look at all the human sacrifices around the world over thousands of years, and in many cases you just have to throw a dart at the dartboard. You'll hit the bullseye eventually, and then you can claim that what you did got it right. So, and I'll tell you why. The climate change science is not a science. What is it? We are trying to actually look at multiple variables which are non-linear. If you know what that means, we've got say 5 independent variables. We can't control any of them. We don't know which way they're going to go, but the end result will be something will happen. There's no way of predicting what that's going to do. So it actually makes no sense at all to say that we can ever predict weather, far less climate change, because of the number of variables in there. If you've got too many variables and you can't control any of them, you cannot make a prediction. Therefore, it's not a science. It's non-falsifiable. So what we've been dealing with for centuries is catastrophic alarms, making false claims about our impending doom and the fact that we're just about to go over the edge of the cliff. It's never happened yet. We've had a number of things like Krakatoa, A number of volcanoes have blown up and caused all sorts of catastrophes. We've had asteroids hit the Earth, all sorts of things. But none of them have been through CO2 or the normal things that you are being told now are causing climate change and disaster. Now, back in 2010, and I'll go even further back later, but back in 2010, I made the mistake in one of my overseas trips of going to the airport and picking up a book to read on the plane, which I normally do. I've got a stack of these books I've bought for plane reading. And one of them, unfortunately, was Flim Flam Flannery's The Weather Makers. And if I could have opened the door, I would have jumped out somewhere between there and my destination. It was so annoying reading this book, and it was fairly new at the time. The other frustration is the sheer ineptitude, innumeracy, and scientifically illiterate politicians that we have to deal with. And when I was up in Eden Monaro last weekend, one woman came up to me and said, "I only vote on climate. What is your climate policy?" And I said, "We need more CO2. And I don't think Rick got that vote. I'm sorry about that, Rick, but anyway. Most of the politically motivated scientists, and we've had Michael Mann out here on a $1 million fee to come out here and lecture to people in New South Wales. Thank God your taxpayers are paying for it. Actually, it was the federal paid for it. So you have all these charlatans who come out and make all these predictions. You can prove them wrong time and again. Paul Ehrlich was part of the Club of Rome. He made predictions in the 1970s. He said there would be no oil by the year 2000. By the year 2000, we were awash with oil. Now, have a look at the price. We've discovered billions upon billions of barrels. By the way, when I actually wrote in 2012, how much oil did we have in the world then? How many years? Anyone like to tell me how many years supply of oil at current extraction methods was available? 50 years? Very close, 45. All right, today. Yeah, you just got it. Today, here we are in now, 2020, 20 years after Ehrlich's prediction there will be no oil in the world by the year 2000, not a drop. How many years supply do we have now? Given all the billions of barrels, we take out 8 billion barrels a day, 8 million barrels a day. How much oil have we got now? Keep going. 75. Keep going. 100. More. Less. Right now, using current methods of extraction, we've got 150 years supply. And that's why I'm not in the oil industry anymore, because we found so much of the rotten stuff, they don't need to explore anymore for about another 75 years, which will make me about 150, and I don't want to be working at that age. Okay, so what you have is a bunch of charlatans who have told you all these lies all these years. The fact that they've been wrong on every occasion didn't stop them at all. You just moved to the next prediction and moved the date forward again. Trying to cash in climate scam no matter what the cost to Australians, which is why we've moved South Australia to be like North Korea and it's on wind. If it wasn't for the connector to Victoria, they'd be out of electricity. The climate deceivers, in my opinion, are the most sophisticated organised crime syndicate in the world since communism, which actually said, if we just control people in the way they do things, they'll all become better people, which we know never happens. So this climate mafia, and that's apologies to the mafia, are a bunch of unconvicted leftovers from the now defunct, and it's no longer defunct again, it's back again, from the old socialist totalitarians of yesteryear. So they will use any green fool, lie, alarm, unethical data tampering. Just look at Jennifer Marahasi's looking at all of the numbers in Australia that have been adjusted all the way back to the actually just in the 1900s, because they don't go further back. So someone has gone along and taken the temperatures faithfully at all these stations, and now 100 years later someone goes back and moves and takes off 1 degree to make it cooler in the past, making it warmer in the future. And Jennifer's proved that by going through a whole series of the stations around Australia. So what are they doing it for? Why would you do a fraud like that? How would you like to wake up and work for the Bureau of Meteorology, and each day you go to work and commit fraud? What a way to make a living. So why are they doing it? Their aim is to destroy Australian society as part of globalism. Now, let's have a look at a couple of incontrovertible laws that everyone can agree on. These are my laws. Everything you're told by the lamestream pseudoscientists is a lie. Whatever you hear about the temperatures going up, you might have noticed just 2 days ago there was a temperature in Siberia where it topped 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And everyone was, this is catastrophic, and this was absolute proof of climate change. So when you get the lowest possible temperature just a few years earlier in Antarctica, which set a new low record, that was weather. So and by the way, I looked at all the scene around all the stations in Siberia, and it was an outlier. The next nearest temperature was 36.1 degrees. Now, who knew that places in Siberia could get that warm in the summer as early as June? They do, and it's a regular occurrence. The fact that it topped 100 actually beat the last record by 0.7 of a degree, if it was that accurate. So unless it's automated, someone reading a thermometer wouldn't have quite got that right. Everything you know about climate is wrong because you've been told so many lies over the years that someone can come up and say, I only vote on climate. And she was a young to middle-aged woman. Every 20-year prediction, climate prediction ever made has ended up being wrong. You cannot go back and find me a prediction made, say, in 1923 about the Arctic was going to be ice-free by such and such a year, and it's ever proven true. You can't go back and find any of these that turned out to be true 20 years later. By the way, what do you know about the Arctic in 1909?
It was ice-free.
It was, because that's when Amundsen found the Northwest Passage. So it was ice-free then. You could actually sail across then. Now you use an icebreaker and you can get through anyway. Climate science is a pseudoscience like alchemy or astrology. And by that, it's because it's a non-linear, multiple variable set, and so therefore you cannot predict it. If you cannot predict a falsifiable claim, then you cannot call it a science. It's a guess. Climate catastrophism is about money, power, and political control. That's what it's really all about. Climate catastrophism is more akin to the woman who comes up and says, I only vote on climate change. I don't care what the rest of your policies are, it's on climate change. That turns it into a cult or a religious belief, where you see only one side and you won't talk to anyone else about it. And the climate cult cannot be defeated by science, logic, or reality. Try discussing this with anyone, like the gentleman here, and you'll find you cannot get through to them by any means of science, logic, or reality. Now, it's unfortunate you can't see the graphs that will come up, but I'd like to just ask, do I have your attention now? Okay, good. Now, the other thing, and because it's being taped, I can't really say this, but I was going to say Chatham House rules applies, because I'm going to make a few libelous statements along the way. Now, my redeeming road to climate heresy was back in 1962, I should have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Climate before climate science had ever become a climate. I was actually doing a school project, and you were given 6 months to come up with some idea. I mean, I went to a very good school where you actually had to almost do a PhD to get your A in physics. And I actually thought, I'll do climate. No one had ever heard of climate. What I was going to do is graph the daily temperatures 3 times a day, and what I was going to do was try and calculate how you actually worked out the wind chill factor. That was my big PhD thesis at school. My teacher actually said, nah, that's too simple. Do something else. So I actually calculated the muzzle velocity of a bullet by firing it up a canal. So I got an A for that. But here's, in 1962, they thought that climate was too simple. But I got interested in this, and I actually kept a graph that went all the way through, from August through until I left Scotland in February of the next year, and actually brought that graph to Australia. And I did work out the calculations of looking up the weather each day and finding out what the temperature was. Now I had a protected thermometer and one that would actually also get the wind, and I could calculate the difference between the two and therefore work out a mathematical calculation for wind chill. I thought it was very clever actually, but the science teacher thought that was too simple. In 1973 at University of WA, I used this knowledge to write an essay on energy, and it was not appreciated. Why not? Even by 1973, the Club of Rome, Ehrlich, had now become the Bible for all of this. If you were not following the path of Ehrlich and his catastrophes, then you were on the outside already. And I hadn't quite come to that realization at the time. So I had to fight for any results that I got. And then, of course, I mentioned in 2009, I didn't do much about it for a long time after that. In 2009, I read The Weather Makers. In 2010 to 2012, I focused my study on climate on my flight. So I got a lot of printouts from the internet, I got a lot of books on the subject, and came to the conclusion that the climate studies could not actually be a science because of these variables. Now, one of the people actually that you probably know of is Karl Popper. Everyone know Karl Popper? Well, what he said about science was, the normal basic scientific process is ask a question, conduct background research of previous work, which is what I was doing, construct a hypothesis, conduct experiments to test the hypothesis, analyze your data and results, and draw appropriate conclusions, especially if they don't fit your actual hypothesis. Communicate your results to the world, and then have your paper peer reviewed. Now, it turned out, of course, that the climate deceivers have come up with an entirely new form here, and it is make an alarmist or catastrophic statement. We are reaching a tipping point after which we are doomed. James Hansen, 1989. I'm sure when were we doomed? Are we still here? Oh yeah, we're still here. Construct an unprovable hypothesis 20 to 100 years into the future. The seas will rise 20 meters in a century. Al Gore, Tim Flannery, Robin Williams on the science program in Australia. Obtain funding to conduct targeted research, not general research. You want to find the result that you've actually predetermined to support a predetermined outcome for your hypothesis. I've used Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. Phil Jones, East Anglia University. We cannot account for the recent cooling, and it's a travesty that we cannot. Our measurement systems are inadequate because they're not giving me the result I want. Kevin Trenberth, a pseudoscientist who refuses to believe his own results because they do not meet his computer's prediction. Now that takes one's breath away. Attempt to denigrate or remove all opposition or attempts to test your hypothesis. Recently, of course, we've had the situation, not quite to do with climate, but what's his name, Peter Ridd in JCU being removed from the university for contradicting their grant machine by saying that the Great Barrier Reef, which he studied for 30 years, is not in trouble. The other one here is I cannot see these papers getting into the report even if Kevin and I have to redefine the definition of what is peer review. Now there's a way of keeping everyone out of giving an alternate opinion. And that was put up by Phil Jones to Kevin Trenberth, Ben Santa, Michael Mann, Ken Britta, and others. Obtain a consensus, which is actually a political approach, of course, not a scientific one, through fear and withholding of data and information that could be used to validate or disprove the hypothesis. This is the ultimate corruption of the scientific process. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try to find something wrong with it? What? That was Phil Jones. That was Phil Jones to the Australian Warwick Hughes, a researcher in Perth, who questioned the Oz figures they quoted. Because Phil, that's how the scientific method works. But obviously he didn't know. Maybe I'll cut a few points off the filtered cuff, as that's trending down because of the recent cold years. So they simply truncated the graph. Mike Kelly of CIU blatantly falsifying the results to fit the theory. So you can see the difference there between what Popper was doing and what Popper says should be doing, and then what the climate scientists actually do, and they still do it to this day. Now, Richard Feynman, of course, said, I don't care how elegant your hypotheses and theories are. If they don't fit the data, you're wrong. Now, that's a true physicist. You wonder how the Americans these days could have put a man on the moon. Okay, now I can't show you this diagram here, but it's a geological history of climate, which I found fairly early on, and it's by a guy called Scotese. And what he did was he tracked through rocks the geological temperatures and also the CO2 levels. I'll just tell you a couple of interesting things here. There's a huge drop in temperature at the end of Ordovician period, which is the early part of life. What do you know about the end of Ordovician? What happened then? There was a mass extinction. Now, at that stage, the CO2 level was coming down, and it was actually only 20,000 parts per million, somewhat above today's level, but the temperature went off the edge of the cliff right down to freezing throughout the world. We had what was called snowball Earth, and we nearly wiped out all of the animals and plants and fish in the sea. Then the temperature got back to what you might call fairly normal, and the CO2 was still sitting around 15,000 parts per million until into the Devonian, when it actually started to fall off very rapidly. Anyone any idea why? Why did the CO2 levels go down? Yes?
Because plants were locking it up.
Well done. The plants were locking it up faster than the animals that were around. There weren't too many land animals around in that days, because that's the beginning of the fish. And so it was falling rapidly, and then we had, at the end of the Carboniferous. Now, what do you know about the Carboniferous? That's when all the coal was made, but it's also the period when life was at its most prolific. And the temperature was actually averaging between 25 and 30 degrees. That's the average. There are reasons actually why you can't get above it. We'll never get a temperature of 100 degrees centigrade anywhere in the world. It just can't happen. Circulation of air will actually remove all of that. But at the end of the Carboniferous, there was the Permian Great Extinction, the largest extinction of life on Earth. Why? Well, the answer might be that the level of CO2 had got down to about 250 parts per million, which barely supports plant life. So it was dying off because there was no food left for them, and the animals just died off. Temperature went back up again, and we get into the Triassic. What happens in the Triassic? Dinosaurs. And so we get through the Triassic and the Jurassic. At the end of the Jurassic, there was a mass extinction, probably caused by a meteor hitting the Earth. The temperature then went back up again, but since then, carbon dioxide has been slowly going downwards until the beginning of the, the industrial age. We were probably down to about 280 parts per million, which is almost starvation for plants. It's gone back up now to about 406. Anyone know the average temperature of the Earth? Now, the average temperature doesn't mean much. It can be 50 degrees in Qatar, which you've been to, and Kuwait, or it can be minus 50 in Turman in Russia, where I've been to. I much prefer the 56 in Qatar to the minus 50 in Turman. But the temperatures, roughly, if you take all the stations around the world and average it out, which means really nothing, but what is the average temperature? Sorry? 15 degrees, correct. And just to confuse you, that's actually 288 Kelvin, working from absolute zero. So what you've got now is, if you look at this graph produced way back in 2001, they did all this through using rocks and eventually getting closer to the current age ice cores. And they came down and they basically said, well, we're actually in a period of carbon dioxide starvation, plus the temperature is extremely low compared to what it's been in the past. How many people do you know this winter will pack up the bongos and move from Cairns to go to Melbourne? Name them. All right, good. How many people wanted to go from Melbourne to Cairns to the warm weather for the winter? Well, there was apparently there was something like 10,000 stuck on the border with Queensland that weren't allowed in. And you might have heard about this. The backup of caravans was some like 30 kilometres. There was nowhere to turn them around when they got stopped at the border. So if I was them, I would just have parked there on the side of the road and stayed there for the winter. But so they're all sent back to Melbourne, where they'll all die of cold now. That's life. So what you've got there, the historical record shows no correlation between CO2 and temperature. And secondly, the Great Permian Extinction could have been caused more than even the cold by a lack of CO2 creating plant life. So I think you have to be fairly simple to believe that 400 parts per million. Now, Malcolm Roberts actually got a big pile of rice and he said, consider that to be a million. And they put 400 grains out here and he said, that is what you're telling me controls the climate of Earth. Not possible. So even if we got to 800. Anyway, I sent something around which I'll tell you about later to every environmentalist I knew and asked them 2 questions, and I'll come back to those. Only one replied, and that was Patrick Moore. So I couldn't get any of the littlies to reply, but one of the famous environmentalists, in fact, took the trouble to reply. I had to go back to him and say, you're still too low. So what really controls the climate? The sun, the moon, the planets, and the concentration of CO2 might have some effect, but it's a minor part. The eccentricity of our orbit around the Milankovitch cycles, which take us further and closer to the sun at different periods, over 100,000 years, is one of the reasons why we're having this cycle of ice ages and then non-ice ages that last and come up every 100,000 years. Does anyone know what's the concentration of CO2 on Mars? Close? Wrong. Try somewhere in between. 96. You're 95, he's 97. It's 96. What's the concentration of CO2 on Venus? 97. Now, can you see how important that 1% difference is? Now, Mars is freezing. I mean, you step outside there and you turn into a ball of ice. You go to Mars and it's 900 degrees centigrade. Venus, rather. Venus. I'm just checking that you're all still awake. So what you've got is 1% difference. They're both CO2. And yet one, we're told, has got a tipping point, and if we get to another couple of percent more, we'll reach that tipping point. So CO2 has got nothing to do with it, or very little to do with it. So what you have is this promotion of unscientific, non-falsifiable hypotheses and theories that come out all the time. And they're all designed because there's another agenda that's being taken care of here. Now, I make the point here that destination is unknown because I asked every environmentalist I could contact to tell me what the destination was, and I'll come to that in just a moment. Climate science rates, in my opinion, with alchemy, astrology. Who here reads the horoscopes to see what their day is going to be like? It's a big female thing. And it's always right, isn't it? There you go. So I actually regard climate science as being more like alchemy than anything else. But if you give me a grant big enough, I'll prove whatever you like. Just has to be a big enough grant. Now, the University of East Anglia has been monitoring the climate through a satellite that was launched in 1979. And it actually shows that, and I had all this at the time, don't forget I wrote this paper in 2012 and I haven't really updated it. If you take the average for the whole period, now there was an El Nino in 1998 and the temperature was quite considerably higher. And there was another one in 2010, but when this was finished in 2012, we were actually minus 0.1 degrees centigrade lower than the average. And that's between 79 and 2012. So take all those years and we're actually 0.1 of a degree less than we were for the average over the whole period. So much for global warming. I think I'll put another, where's my pullover? Need to put that on. Now, if we don't know the destination we seek, how will we know when you're there? That's a question that's great to ask. So there's two killer questions you should ask anyone. And by the way, I tried this on the Labour guy. He was then telling this lady about how good the Labour climate policy was, that they were going to wipe out 50% of all CO2 emissions by 2050. And she nearly wet herself and went off to vote for them. Now here's the two killer questions you should ask. What's the optimum global temperature we seek? Who would like to tell me what the global optimum temperature is, average? Now we're told that 15 degrees we're getting up, and 17 degrees is far too high. Yet we know it's already been 25 and 30 degrees on a worldwide basis. We know the Antarctic we've got coal in the Antarctic. We know that the Arctic has been totally ice-free for many, many thousands of years. So what's the optimum temperature that we seek? Sorry?
About the Gold Coast.
Well, that would be not too bad. It means actually Qatar would get a bit warmer. So if nobody can tell you the answer of what destination we seek, is it 16 degrees or 13 degrees or as Kenneth Field said in Earth Day 1970, if we drop 4 degrees, we'll be in another ice age. So obviously 10's too low, 17's too high, we're on 15, and they're telling you 17's too high. I want, well done. We need more warmth, but that's beside the point. My answer is, ask any catastrophist what his ideal temperature is, and you won't get a straight answer. The second question you should ask anyone is, what is the optimum concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere? Now, we're currently about 406. We were about 280 at the beginning of the industrial age. There's a number of reasons why it's gone up, beside the fact that we pump CO2 into the atmosphere by burning coal. But the answer from Patrick Moore was 2,000 parts per million, 5 times what we currently have. My answer was 4,000 parts per million. And if you happen to be a submariner on a nuclear submarine with ballistic missiles that can destroy half the world, what's the concentration of CO2 in one of those?
8,000.
I told you, it was 8,000. How do you know that?
We've been reading the same books you've been reading.
Oh, okay. 8,000 parts per million. Now, if they can survive easily and live in this 8,000 parts per million, how can 400 be dangerous? So anyway, but ask them to answer the question. When I asked the Labour guy that at Eden Monaro, he said, I don't talk to deniers. And I said, well, you're the denier, not me. Tell me what it is. I'm not going to talk to you anymore, because they cannot answer that question. We don't know the destination, but we'll move heaven and earth and wreck Australia to get there. Now, the catastrophic global temperature myth. I've been to Tumen in Siberia. The day I was there, it was minus 50 degrees. Nasty. By the way, that's 223 degrees Kelvin. I've been in Kuwait when I went out to the Jurassic field. Now there's a nice name, Jurassic field, that we had just drilled to get, it was 16,000 feet deep to get down to the Jurassic structure. And we were pumping out 200,000 barrels of oil a day and about 2 million cubic feet of gas. And by the way, the pressure was 35,000 kPi. Your car runs on about 10 kPi or something like that, 20 kPi. This was 35,000 kPi. So the temperature when I went out there was plus 50. So I've just come from Russia where it was minus 50, and I'm still wearing the overcoat when we get out there. Even with the air conditioner on, we couldn't get the temperature below 38 degrees. Very nasty, and I didn't have the right shoes on, so I was hopping around because the sand was so hot. You've been there, you've done that. So there's a temperature range that people live in on a permanent basis, of freezing water to steam. Right? We run through all of that. And someone's trying to tell me that a 2 degrees change is the end of the world and it's a tipping point. Not possible. Best guess is currently the average global temperature is about 15 degrees. Now, if you work on Kelvin, that makes it 288 degrees Kelvin. A 2 degrees increase from 288 to 290 is actually 0.07%. Who knew that people were that fragile? That to go out there with a 2 degrees changeover on an average, you would actually be the end of the world. And we've got a gas that constitutes 0.04% of the gas in the atmosphere, and we're told that that is what is driving the climate. You have to be really simple. But then again, don't forget, we also have methane coming out of the soil from the Arctic, and that's what's propelling the flying pigs. Now, let's have a look at drowning. Sea levels are reputed to be rising and have been for a long time, over about 3 millimeters per year. Now, I live in a suburb of Melbourne, which is well inland, and I'm looking forward to being on the seafront, especially as Al Gore has bought more than one seafront property, and Flannery's actually has a veranda in which the stakes are in the water. But he doesn't seem to be too worried about the sea level rise. What do you know about Denison Island?
Oh, Fort Denison. You mean the current sea levels are lower than they were?
They're 5 inches lower than they were in 1901. And nobody knows why, because this is a geologically stable area. So it should not be If it's stable, why is it dropping? And I have a very nice picture here, which is put there in Tasmania, in Hobart, by Captain Ross. And he put the high water mark and cut it into the rock. Have you seen it? On David Hughes, was it David Hughes? The guy who died, I've forgotten his name now, but he took a photo of this and had it on his blog. It was put there in 1841, and the current high water level is 3 inches below it. And we're told that the world is rising at 3 millimeters per year, and we're all going to drown soon, and Denver will be the seafront of America. Yeah, right, and the Rocky Mountains will just be poking out. So if you can believe any of that, even about rising, that is rising in some places. It's also falling in the Baltic. Does anyone know why? Yes.
Well, it's still deep, as in Canada and parts of
No,
America.
Baltic's on the
Yes,
other
but
side.
It's still decompressing from the
Correct.
The ocean.
What do you call it? Norway and Sweden are actually rising, because they were under thousands of feet of ice. Now, if you come from Scotland, you go to Glencoe. The mountains there are about 3,500 feet high. If you want to do that in meters, about 1,000 meters high, and they're U-shaped because a glacier went right down there. There was another 5,000 feet above that during the Ice Age. So you're talking 8,000 feet of ice there, or whatever that is in meters. So when you look at this, and I'm now supposed to be worried about sea levels rising at 3 millimeters a year, we're also told that the ocean is acidifying. No, it's not. It's alkaline, and you cannot actually get it to be acidic. There's just too much alkaline things there. And so, well, there's no tipping point for acidification. And one of the studies, which I rather appreciated, was they went out and found some vents that CO2 was coming through the seafloor from some leakage under the seafloor. And guess what was sitting right on top of these vents? Coral, which is supposed to, of course, not be able to stand this sort of acidification. So that didn't work out either. So lies upon lies. Now in WA at Useless Loop, you've all been there, of course. It's the next spot on your travel diary. I mean, doesn't the sound of a name like Useless Loop appeal to you to go and drive 5,000 kilometers? Well, when you get there, you'll find it's absolutely useless. And the reason it's useless is it's very, very shallow, and it's a huge area. And a couple of early explorers' ships went in there and found that it was very, very, they had to kedge to get out, if you know what that is. So they had a great deal of difficulty getting back out again. But what is there, and I have some pictures of it here, and I've actually seen them, is stromatolites. You all know what stromatolites are. Not quite. They're not. They're actually very tiny little creatures that actually live and die, and then the next one goes on top, and they're cyanobacteria, which means they don't actually need oxygen. And they don't really like being out of the water for very long, but because it's so shallow, the tides go down and they can survive this. If you take one of these and drill into it and look at the fossils in it and date it, the earliest ones where this started off is about 10 million years. So they've been around for a long time. Now, if this water had been rising at such a huge rate, why are these things still around? Why is Useless Loop still there in another geologically stable area? Now, you can go further north, and up in the Pilbara, I've actually seen you might have seen recently that someone has claimed that they've found underwater, under the sea, an Aboriginal campsite from 10,000 years ago or something. Quite possible. The sea level has been rising, and this was a very shallow area, and these people are diving about 30 feet of water. So over 10,000 years, this has actually risen. But it doesn't seem to have changed much at Useless Loop, and it's been falling at Denison Island. So what you've got there, the other thing was, we heard, do you remember the fellow from Queanbeyan who got himself the position of going to the United Nations and telling them all about the sinking islands? And he burst into tears because Tuvalu was disappearing. Tuvalu's not disappearing. And in fact, on many of those coral islands, the other thing is that as these islands, and some of them are sinking because they were on top of old undersea mountains, as they sink, the corals keep growing, and you've got a number of them, and a lot of the reasons why you see these coral circles is because that's where they've come up and the center has actually collapsed. So you get these lagoons. So corals grow, islands sink, and yes, islands do sink. But give me a grant and I'll prove whatever you want. I still haven't got this crowdfunding grant going out of you people yet. Just tell me the answer you want and I'll find it. And there's my picture of stromatolites. The other one was that sea levels with and without adjustments. Now, I don't actually know who produced this particular graph because it's in my notes, but it's not here. I've got the notes where it came from. But what it showed there was a thing called the TopX Poseidon Satellite, which was all over the place. And they actually found it had an instrumentation problem. And they've since managed to sort of correct that, but then they put up another satellite called Envisat, which has been much more accurate. And what's happening now is between the predictions, which they were having before through a number of other measurements, is now falling off using satellites. So that by the end of here, there was a difference of nearly 1.5 degrees, doesn't sound much, between the satellite on sea levels and the actual prediction. 1.5 degrees, sorry, 1.5 centimeters. So sea levels are not rising significantly, that actually would be dangerous to us. So let's have a look at what I call the biblical plagues of Australia. The falsification of whatever you read. The fact that someone will tell you that we're getting bigger and worse bushfires. We're not. What was the year of the worst bushfire in Australia? 1974. Nope. Last century. 1851. And there's a picture in the National Gallery that covers a whole wall there of the people running in front of this fire. That destroyed more acreage than the last fire, which by the way was the 5th largest. The ones we just had were the 5th largest we've had in Australia ever. 1939 was bigger, and there was another one, I can't remember which one it was. Now, why are we getting these fires at all? Can't we control them? Why didn't the Aboriginals get them? Yes?
Well, they changed the face of the continent flora-wise by controlled burning. They created...
Well, that's one reason. In fact, what's happening now is that we're not burning off the undergrowth. That, in fact, I've heard actually that in one of the councils, actually, they won't let them move the undergrowth because the termites need somewhere to live. And so instead they destroy 5,000 or 50,000 koalas or whatever it is. So we also are being told we get worse floods, which was we had that terrible flood a few years ago. I can't remember the actual year. It was quite close in Brisbane. Anyone know the year of the sorry? No, it wasn't 17. 2011 is the one. And everyone was, there was the most catastrophic flood we'd ever had. No, it wasn't. What was the one that was bigger? Close. 1896. In fact, that was actually taller. Now, after they won in 1973, I think it was, they got out and they built a dam. What's the dam called? Wivenhoe. And the Wivenhoe Dam was a flood mitigation dam. And you're actually supposed to keep it empty. And then, because it's empty, what you do is when the floods come along, you open it and you fill it up, and that takes an enormous amount of water. Tim Flannery stood at the base of that dam when it was empty and said, look, there's no water, which was exactly what it was designed to do. But he said, and because we're in the beginning of a 1,000-year flood, we'll never fill it. It'll never fill even when the rains come. So what did the government in Queensland do? They filled it up. So when it rained, they had to let the water out of it too. And it really did flood. Everything. Brilliant. So it's actually more to do with management and not following your own logic that caused these sort of catastrophes. Falsification of Bureau of Meteorology temperatures. Jennifer Marassi is right across this, and she continues to actually demonstrate, for instance, at Rutherglen, at Goulburn. At Goulburn, they recorded a minimum temperature that was 4 degrees above what the real temperature was. And they said it's because our measurement system wouldn't go that low. We've also got falsification of environmental crisis. For instance, the Marine Misnamed Centre of Excellence, which faked experimental results. Have you read about that? That, was she Norwegian or Swedish or something? Swedish. She falsified every study that she did. And yet they kicked Peter Ridd out for sort of saying, this isn't right. So telling the truth gets you martyred. By the way, she still has a doctorate and is still working overseas. I've been following her. Lies about cyclones are increasing when in fact they're increasing when in fact they're actually decreasing. Actually, it doesn't matter. I don't care if they're increasing or decreasing. They're all a natural event. So we can't go along and say they're decreasing, therefore that proves that we're right and they're wrong. It wouldn't have mattered if they were increasing. I'd still say the same thing. It's just a natural event and we can't control it. There's nothing special about getting more cyclones or bigger cyclones than we've had. What was the year of Katrina in America? Very good, 2006, because I was there the next year. The interesting thing about it was Katrina was supposed to be the event that no one could have predicted. Do you know it was the 5th Category 5 cyclone to go through that area since 1756 when records began? The 5th. So if you want to do your sums, they were overdue. And of course the mayor of New Orleans said, we don't have these anymore, and refused to build the levees higher. So what we really have is a failure of political will and leadership in developing our assets, our industrial potential, our ability to deal with climate change by adapting to it rather than destroying our economy by burning down and blowing up our power stations. By the way, Pelican Point in South Australia is an interesting one because an ex-army friend of mine was the operations manager there. Right, he's getting close to my age, he was due for retirement anyway. So when they came along and blew it up, he moved to Vietnam, where he's now built the extension to the world's 11th largest coal-fired power station, which gets me extremely cheap electricity. My electricity bill for the year is about $600. My electricity bill for the quarter here is more than $600. Anyway, I appreciate his efforts to build a coal-fired power station 30 kilometers from where I am, and I appreciate the fact that my electricity is very cheap. I can light the place up like a Christmas tree for ships to navigate by at night. So we are actually, my point was, we are actually choosing to fail. We are choosing a course of action to fail. Now I drove to Ayers Rock. Well, let's still call it Ayers Rock. I went to Ayers Rock and I passed a place on the way there where they've got this huge farm, and I noticed that none of the windmills were actually turning. And I saw some people, and it was actually a little bit of wind passing by. So there was some people actually working on one of them, a crew of them. So I drove off and I said, why aren't they turning? He said, I would switch them off. I said, why? He said, well, we get paid anyway. And of course his boss then came up and said, shut up, you get off the site. So I left and took a few more photos of these non-turning windmills that get paid for anyway. So you don't actually need the wind power. I would build a wall across the border between us and South Australia and not let them come in, and I wouldn't send them any electricity. So from here, yeah, I know. Anyway, my biblical scale pox that's affected Australia is called treasonous greenfool politicians and fake scientists. Now, why are we losing? The peak of the climate hysteria was 1997 El Nino. Since then, we've had ClimateGate, we've had the failure of every alarmist prediction. They've just moved them forward another 20 years. We've got the rising lunacies like Extinction Rebellion. We've got St. Greta predicting the end of the world in just 12 years. 2030. So why are we still losing with all this evidence on our side? Realists always fight a defensive battle. Someone makes a crazy prediction or a crazy statement. Oh, look, the temperature in the Arctic is now over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees, 0.4. And that's climate, that's the proof of climate. So we go off and we investigate that. And the latest Quadrant magazine actually has an article in it written by someone who's analysed this and said, no, this is quite normal. This is as bad as the prediction they made last year about the Antarctic. But instead of anyone listening to that, we've moved on. So it's too late. They've won the battle. The temperature in the Arctic is over 100 degrees every day, winter and summer, trust me. So we move on and no one will hear about that again. The realists research, debunk and answer the green fool lies weeks after the alarmist prediction, and then by then the world has moved on, so we lose. And we never do the same thing. So how do you need to deal with this? Well, I'm not suggesting that we go out and tell similar lies, but you need to treat climate cultists not like normal people. We tend to treat them as if they're normal and we can hold a reasonable debate with them. In fact, they're deranged psychopaths. And you need to treat them and mock them. Well, that's obvious. So we need to treat them and mock them like any other escaped lunatic. So, taken into that, never ever defend your position. Always ask by turning it round and going on the attack. You cannot defend your position because they never defend theirs. Okay, so what's the ideal temperature? Not telling you. What's the ideal concentration of CO2? No, I'm not talking to a denier. So that's how they never defend themselves. So why should you defend any position you take? Okay. Finally, I came down to and I said, this is not about climate or any of these things. It's all about Australia. The decline and fall of Australia as a sovereign nation with all these opportunities. But now, globalization, which came in what year? What was the year we signed up to globalization in Australia? 73, the Lima Declaration. Well, why did we sign up to it? What does the Lima Agreement actually ask us to do? Correct. So we are too rich. Share. Send all your... So what's happened? We used to have 17% of our population worked in manufacturing. It's now below, I think it's 9% or something. We've halved it. And the people that are doing what you might call manufacturing now are now assembling IKEA for you. We're not doing what we used to do before. We could invent things, we could build things, we could make things, we could do all of these things. Now we can't. Yeah. Ricardo, where did your uniform come from? China. We closed down the Bendigo clothing factory. We made all the uniforms for the army because it was cheaper to get them from China. So we're in the position where you'll be fighting naked and barefoot. Yeah, that'll frighten the enemy. And it doesn't matter which party you put in, both sides support it. In fact, 4 out of 4 of the major parties support globalization, and it absolutely irritates me when I meet some of these politicians. So the UN is working towards a one world government, and by unelected bureaucrats. Brexit means that Britain has actually escaped if Boris can actually get his act together. Oh. By the way, do you know he worked in Australia? He was a teacher at Geelong College. Yep. But many politicians of our treasonous major parties all support globalization and one world government. So we've got 7 deadly sins causing our national decline. I'll come back to what they are. Lack of unity, national pride in who we are. Now we've got divisions everywhere. I wrote an article actually for Quadrant called Multiculturalism, the greatest, it's not the greatest crime of all, but the greatest, what do you call it? Multiculturalism is the, what do you call it when you, bias of all is the greatest thing. Because what you're doing is, if I'm saying, I'm going to, see, I used to belong to the Latvian club, and I used to belong to the Danish club, and I played soccer for an Italian club at one stage, and they all welcomed me, but they all paid for themselves. Now the government came along and said, no, we can help your national thing, we'll give you money for your multiculturalism. Now what you're getting is the second generation believes they're actually Macedonian or Greek or Italian or Yugoslav. And now we've divided ourselves into tribes. So what we have is, as you pointed out, deliberately destructive energy policies in Australia. For whatever reason we started this, we've now ended up by blowing up most of the power stations. And by the way, I worked at Loy Yang and they gave me a gold watch for it. We cannot do without coal. We cannot do without as much oil as we can get, and we've got plenty of gas if only we could extract it. And so all these lies that you hear about, fracking will destroy the water table. No, it won't. There's only one well in Australia. It was dug in Queensland, which is dug by it, is they didn't sleeve the well and the chemicals leaked out. They didn't actually get into the water supply, but when you go down that well, you can pull out all these nasty chemicals. And by the way, they've changed the way they frack now, and basically use sand and high pressure water, not the same chemicals that we're using before. So, we've also got a huge decline, I believe, and I'm ex-army, and so is Ricardo, and so are you. And I think we've got a huge decline in the quality of the Australian Defence Force. Not of the soldiers themselves, or perhaps even some of the junior officers, but at the senior level. It's an absolute disgrace. Probably. Possibly. Don't talk to Ricardo and I about that. What's actually occurring is we've now got a decline in Australian self-confidence and our self-belief. I was asked why we didn't develop something in Australia, and the answer that came back to me was, oh, we're too small, we can't do that. Yet I used to sell the software of a company from America, which was called Progress Software, and they sold on a global basis. And when I found out they only had 12 people working there in a village in New Hampshire, miles out of town, this didn't make any sense. Because we were living in the middle of Melbourne, and I was told it was too expensive and too difficult, and we just didn't have the ability to do this in Australia. And I had 3 million people surrounding me at that time, and some of the best brains around. But that was the attitude. We've lost that self-confidence and our ability to actually say we can do whatever we want to do. And don't talk to me about submarines. Recovering Australia as a sovereign nation. Donald Trump and Nigel Farage have both shown how it can be done. Le Pen tried, and even to some extent Pauline Hanson has been trying to say the right things. Unfortunately, Pauline's not the brightest spark. Close the borders for 5 years. Sorry, Grandma, family reunion doesn't give you a family pension. Encourage Oz enterprise and manufacturing through tariffs, free trade export agreements that favour us. No more of this, we can import everything. We need to promote strategic industries, where we say this is an industry that Australia must have at any cost, and we have to have that in Australia. Develop strategic vision for Australia, such as the Bradfield Scheme. We've been talking now, by the way, in Melbourne, we've been talking about the light rail system to go to the airport since we built the airport at Tullamarine. They promised it in the next election. It's been promised now since 1960. When was the Great Train Robbery? 61 or when it, yeah, because the guy who escaped there actually ended up working at Tullamarine. So probably about 65 we've been talking about it, still haven't got it. So we need a strategic vision for Australia, and of course, give me a grant and I'll give you whatever answer you want. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks for your time. It was very good. A bit long, but it was a great evening, and thank you for being around. We did start late.